going out alone, I wouldn't recommend it.
Aisle narrows.
Do you want the easy way or the hard way? Think you can handle that?
Yeah, I think I can handle it.
You made it! It's me from the gas station.
Something got into my gear last night and took everything.
I'm sorry. It's a drastic bummer. You hungry?
Just kind of looking for that gear.
So look, it's very simple. It'll be fine.
Everybody got a target tonight. Everybody come along for the ride. No time to rest.
What's the matter?
Just do your best.
Do you like danger?
What you hear is not a test. Everything getting harder to find.
Are you playing a game? Is that what you think we're doing?
Everybody going out of their skin.
Let's do it.
I'm deadly sharp shooting the game.
The most dangerous thing in the wilderness is never the storm, the cliffs, or the darkness hiding between the trees. It is the moment a human being realizes survival matters more than morality. That is the fear pulsing through Apex, a survival thriller that turns the Australian wilderness into a psychological battlefield where trust disappears one step at a time. The film arrives with the energy of a relentless chase movie, but underneath the action and suspense sits a story about grief, trauma, isolation, and the terrifying instinct to keep living even when nature itself seems determined to erase you. Apex is a 2026 survival action thriller film that arrived on the global streaming platform Netflix on April 24, 2026, marking one of the most anticipated original productions the platform had assembled in its years of commissioning high concept genre cinema. The film was directed by the acclaimed Icelandic filmmaker Baltasar Kormakur, written by Jeremy Robbins, and starred an exceptional trio of internationally celebrated performers in Charlize Theron, Taron Egerton, and Eric Bana. With a running time of 95 minutes, the film tells the story of a grieving rock climber named Sasha who, while seeking solitude and healing in the wilderness of Australia, finds herself hunted by a deeply dangerous man whose motives are rooted in something primal and terrifying. At its core, Apex is a film about survival, not merely physical survival against a predator in the wild, but deeper, more agonizing survival of guilt, grief, and the psychological weight of loss that can crush a person long before any external threat arrives to finish the job. The film emerged from a specific creative and industrial moment in Hollywood and streaming cinema in which survival thrillers had reasserted themselves as a particularly potent and commercially viable genre. In the years preceding Apex, audiences had shown a consistent appetite for narratively lean, tension driven films that place singular protagonists, often women, in environments of extreme physical and psychological danger. The genre had been reinvigorated by a series of films that stripped away the elaborate scaffolding of ensemble action movies and returned instead to something more elemental: one person, one landscape, one enemy, and the question of whether the human will to live is ultimately stronger than the forces conspiring to extinguish it. Apex arrived into this conversation with considerable pedigree, assembling creative talents who had individually demonstrated a capacity for exactly this kind of stripped down intensity, and the result was a film that, while not universally celebrated, generated significant audience engagement and critical discussion from the moment of its release. To understand Apex fully is to understand something of the filmmakers and performers who created it, the tradition of survival cinema from which it draws, the specific landscapes and logistical challenges that shaped its production, and the thematic concerns it pursues with considerable earnestness beneath its surface of propulsive genre thrills. This article attempts to explore all of these dimensions in depth, tracing the film from its origins as a spec script acquired by Netflix through its complex production in Australia and Iceland, its reception by critics and audiences, and its place within the broader bodies of work of its principal creators. Baltasar Kormakur is one of the most distinctive directors working in international cinema, a filmmaker whose career has traced an arc from early Icelandic art house work through to large-scale Hollywood productions without ever entirely losing the sensibility that made his early films so striking. Born in Reykjavik in 1966, Kormakur spent his early career as an actor before transitioning to directing, and his breakthrough international recognition came with the crime film 101 Reykjavik in 2000, which he directed and in which he also appeared. The film was an adaptation of the novel by Hallgrímur Helgason and established Kormakur as a filmmaker with a sharp eye for character, an ability to extract dark comedy from domestic dysfunction, and an instinctive feel for the textures of everyday Icelandic life. It was a film deeply rooted in a specific cultural moment, capturing the ennui and drift of a generation of young Icelanders while also functioning as a broadly accessible human comedy. But it was with subsequent work that Kormakur began to develop what would become perhaps the defining preoccupation of his directorial career: the relationship between human beings and extreme environments, and the ways in which nature, in all its indifference and overwhelming scale, can strip a person down to something essential, revealing character and will in ways that ordinary life never could. This preoccupation found its fullest early expression in The Deep from 2012, a film based on the extraordinary true story of Gudlegur Frithiorsson, the only survivor of a fishing boat accident in 1984, who swam 6 hours through the freezing waters of the North Atlantic to reach the Icelandic shore. The film is a meditation on survival as much as it is a dramatic reconstruction of an astonishing real event. And it demonstrated Kormakur's ability to sustain tension across a narrative in which the outcome is technically known from the beginning, drawing the audience into the experience of survival rather than the suspense of whether survival is possible. Everest, released in 2015, brought Kormakar to the largest canvas he had yet worked on, a big budget Hollywood production that recreated the catastrophic 1996 climbing disaster on the world's highest mountain, with a cast that included Jason Clarke, Josh Brolin, Jake Gyllenhaal, Keira Knightley, and Robin Wright. The film was a significant commercial success and demonstrated that Kormakar's feel for environments of extreme danger could operate at scale, working with the logistical and technical demands of a major studio production without compromising the fundamental commitment to depicting nature as genuinely overwhelming and human beings as genuinely fragile. Everest is not a triumphalist film. It is, in many respects, a film about the limits of human capability in the face of forces entirely beyond human control. And this philosophical undercurrent gives it a weight and seriousness that distinguishes it from simpler adventure filmmaking. Beast, released in 2022 and starring Idris Elba, represented another significant entry in Kormakur's ongoing engagement with survival cinema, placing a father and his daughters in a South African game reserve where they are stalked by a rogue lion. The film worked with Framestore, the visual effects company that would go on to contribute to Apex, and demonstrated Kormakar's evolving command of creature-based suspense, his ability to use landscape as both setting and character, and his continued interest in protagonists whose internal emotional struggles are as significant as their external physical ones. Idris Elba's character in Beast is not simply fighting a lion, he is also working through grief, guilt, and the complicated emotional terrain of a man estranged from his children following the death of his wife. This layering of internal and external conflict is a consistent feature of Kormakar's most interesting work, and it is a structural principle that Apex inherits and develops. The screenplay for Apex was written by Jeremy Robbins and acquired by Netflix in February 2024 as a spec script, meaning it was written without a specific commission or attachment to a studio, a practice that was once the dominant mode of Hollywood screenwriting but has become considerably rarer in the contemporary era of IP-driven development. The acquisition of a spec script represents a particular kind of bet, a decision by a studio or platform that the fundamental idea and its execution on the page are strong enough to justify investment without the prior relationship or franchise attachment that so much contemporary studio filmmaking depends upon. That Netflix acquired the Apex screenplay is a testament to both the quality of Robbins's writing and the platform's continued appetite for high concept genre films that can be executed with a relatively contained budget relative to the franchise blockbusters that dominate theatrical releases. The premise of the screenplay is deceptively simple. A woman goes into the wilderness alone, seeking solitude and healing. She is hunted by a man who is not simply a criminal but a practitioner of something deeply ritualistic, someone who has constructed an entire philosophy and practice around the act of hunting and consuming other human beings. The woman must survive not only the physical danger of being hunted in remote terrain, but the psychological burden of guilt she carries from an event that preceded her arrival in the wilderness. The elegance of the premise lies in the way these two things, the external threat and the internal wound, are made to eliminate and interact with each other, so that social survival is not simply a matter of outrunning a killer, but of confronting the guilt that has made her, in some sense, willing to place herself in danger. This is a structurally sophisticated choice that elevates Apex above simpler entries in the survival thriller genre. Many films of this type are content to place a protagonist in danger and allow the instinct for self-preservation to drive the narrative. Apex is interested in something more complicated. What happens when a person's will to survive is compromised by guilt, and how the confrontation with extreme external danger can paradoxically restore a sense of purpose, and the desire to live that grief and guilt have eroded. Sasha at the beginning of the film is not simply bereaved. She is a person who believes on some deep level that she does not deserve to survive, that her survival of the accident that claimed her husband's life was a failure rather than a piece of luck, and that she is responsible for a death that, by any rational analysis, was beyond her control. This psychological dimension is established in the film's opening sequence with considerable economy and skill. We are introduced to Sasha and Tommy in the context of their shared passion for climbing, specifically in one of the most dramatic and visually arresting climbing environments in the world, the Troll Wall in Norway. The Troll Wall, known in Norwegian as Trollveggen, is one of the tallest vertical rock faces in Europe, rising approximately 100 meters above the valley floor of Romsdalen, and it represents a climbing challenge of the highest order, a place where the margin for error is essentially zero and where the consequences of anything going wrong are absolute and immediate. Setting the film's opening sequence here is a deliberate act of scene setting that establishes the world these characters inhabit. A world where extreme risk is not merely tolerated but sought out, where the proximity to death is experienced as a form of heightened aliveness. Sasha and Tommy are tandem climbing, a practice that involves two climbers moving together on a rope, with each dependent on the other's judgment, skill, and physical capacity. The intimacy of this arrangement is also its danger. Two people bound together, each trusting the other with their life. When a storm descends on the troll wall, forcing the pair to abandon their ascent and rappel back down, the situation becomes critical. An avalanche strikes and Tommy is knocked off the face of the rock. Sasha, in the instant of catastrophic decision that defines everything that follows, is forced to let him go. The rope that connected them, that made them a unit, a team, a married couple in the most literal and physical sense. She releases it and Tommy falls to his death. The film does not linger on this moment in a melodramatic way. It understands that the horror of what has happened is best served by restraint, by showing us enough to understand the decision and its consequences without dwelling in the kind of extended anguish that would aestheticize suffering. What is important is not the moment of Tommy's death but the aftermath. The 5 months that pass between the accident and the beginning of the film's primary action, 5 months during which Sasha has been carrying the weight of what happened on that mountain, 5 months during which the question of whether she made the right decision, the only possible decision, or a decision that could have been different has presumably been turning over and over in her mind without resolution. When we next encounter Sasha, she is driving alone toward Wandara National Park in Australia. The choice of destination is significant. Australia is about as far as it is possible to get from Norway geographically and culturally, and the Australian wilderness, hot, dry, ancient, vast, and in many ways still resistant to full human comprehension or control, is about as different as one could imagine from the cold vertical drama of a Norwegian fjord. In choosing this destination, Sasha is not simply seeking a change of scene. She is seeking a kind of erasure, a landscape so entirely different from the one where her life was altered that it cannot carry the associations and memories that more familiar places would hold. She is also perhaps seeking the thing that climbers seek in all extreme environments, an encounter with something large enough and indifferent enough to make the self feel small, to reduce the grinding particularity of personal grief to something more manageable by placing it in a context of elemental scale. A ranger warns Sasha about a string of disappearances in the region she is heading into. This warning is delivered with the matter of fact concern of someone who takes their responsibility for visitor safety seriously, but who also understands that the people who venture into genuinely remote wilderness are self selecting for a degree of risk tolerance that makes certain warnings feel like formalities. Sasha, in the state of mind she is in, may not be particularly moved by warnings about danger. The warning also functions as a piece of narrative foreshadowing that the film handles with a light touch. It establishes that something is wrong in this landscape without specifying what, inviting the audience to bring their own assumptions and then managing those assumptions carefully in what follows. At a service station, one of those transitional spaces that function as the last point of contact with ordinary civilization before the wilderness begins in earnest, Sasha has a tense encounter with two hunters. The hunters are figured from the beginning as a menace, their attitude towards Sasha carrying the casual aggression of men who feel entitled to a dominance they haven't earned. A stranger intervenes, and this stranger is Ben. The introduction of Ben at this moment as someone who performs the service for Sasha, who seemingly protects her from a more immediate and obvious threat, is one of the screenplay's most effective pieces of misdirection. Our instinct, conditioned by countless films in which the helpful stranger is what they appear to be, is to register Ben as an ally, or at least as a neutral presence. The film allows this instinct to operate without confirming or denying it, letting the ambiguity of Ben's introduction do its work. Ben gives Sasha directions to Grand Isle Narrows, steering her toward a specific part of the park. With the benefit of hindsight, this act of navigation is deeply sinister. Ben is directing his prey toward the ground he has prepared for the hunt. But in the moment, it reads as friendly local knowledge, the kind of guidance one traveler might give to another who is less familiar with the terrain. Sasha begins her journey at Blackwater Bay, a name that carries its own atmospheric weight, suggesting depth and obscurity, a place where things might not be clearly visible. The following morning, the hunters from the service station confront Sasha again at the bay. The film uses this encounter to establish Sasha's character more fully. She is not frightened, or if she is frightened, she does not allow fear to make her compliant or diminished. She dismisses the hunters with a directness that sends them away without escalation. This is a woman who has faced genuinely mortal danger on the side of a cliff in Norway. Two aggressive men in a car park are not by comparison particularly terrifying. But this also speaks to something in Sasha's psychological state, a diminishment of the ordinary instinct for self protection that grief can produce, a sense that the things one is supposed to fear are less immediate than the thing one is already carrying. When Sasha kayaks through the rapids and then camps overnight, the film is in its pastoral mode, establishing the beauty and quietness of the landscape, the way solitude in wild places can feel both healing and melancholy. The discovery that her bag has gone missing while she slept is the first clear indication that her solitude is not genuine, that she is being watched. The bag's disappearance is a violation, a small but pointed intrusion on what she believed was her private space. When she stumbles across Ben's camp and he offers her breakfast and supplies, the film is in a zone of deep unease. We sense that something is wrong but cannot yet fully articulate what, and the civilized domestic staging of the breakfast scene, the apparent generosity and hospitality of the offer, makes the underlying menace more unsettling rather than less. Ben's knowledge of Sasha's climbing past, his reference to Tommy's death, and his admission that he has been watching her introduces a different quality of threat. This is not simply a dangerous man in a dangerous place. This is someone who has been following Sasha's story, who has been watching her at the bay, who has taken her bag, acts of surveillance and control that reveal a predatory deliberateness that far exceeds opportunistic menace. When he brings out a crossbow and a stereo, tells Sasha she has until the end of one song before he starts hunting her, the nature of what is happening becomes fully clear. This is not an encounter or a confrontation. This is a hunt, ritualized and prepared, and Sasha is the quarry. The crossbow is an interesting choice of weapon for Ben, and it is worth dwelling on what it communicates about his character. A crossbow is a weapon that requires proximity relative to firearms, a weapon that demands skill and patience rather than simply the pulling of a trigger at range. It belongs to a tradition of hunting that predates gunpowder, that places a premium on the intimate, physical, almost tactile act of the kill. Its use by Ben is consistent with the film's eventual revelation of his character, a man who has constructed an elaborate philosophical and ritualistic framework around the act of hunting, someone for whom the efficiency of modern weapons is beside the point. The point is not to kill efficiently, the point is to hunt. The stereo playing a song as a countdown timer is a detail of almost baroque perversity that reveals something important about Ben's psychology. He is not simply hunting for sustenance or even for the crude gratification of power over another person. He has aestheticized the hunt, turned it into something with a score, a duration, a form. The song as countdown is a performance, and its performance quality suggests a man who has done this before, who has refined the ritual over time, and for whom the theatrical elements are as important as the outcome. This is someone who has made a life's practice of what he does, not a person who has stumbled into violence, but someone who has built an entire identity around it. When Sasha runs, she does so with the efficiency of someone who has spent years in extreme environments, someone whose body knows how to move across difficult terrain, how to read landscape, how to conserve energy, and make rapid decisions about route and risk. She escapes on her kayak, loses it, runs through the riverbank, and encounters what seems to be the sound of a nearby family. Voices that suggest the comforting proximity of other people, other potential witnesses or helpers. The revelation that this is a video recording planted deliberately to lure her is one of the film's most effective set pieces. A moment that transforms the landscape itself into an instrument of the hunt, revealing that Ben has not merely chased Sasha into the wilderness but has prepared the wilderness for her arrival. This detail, the planted recording, is crucial to our understanding of the scope and sophistication of Ben's operation. He is not improvising. He has thought about this, planned for it, created tools and traps that extend his influence across the terrain in ways that go far beyond what a simple physical pursuer could achieve. The landscape is, in a sense, his weapon as much as the crossbow. He knows it, has prepared it, and can use it against someone who does not have his knowledge and preparation. This asymmetry of knowledge and preparation is one of the film's central dramatic devices, and it is what makes Ben genuinely frightening rather than simply physically threatening. Ben shoots at Sasha, forcing her into the river, which is itself a familiar move from the Predator's playbook, using the environment to channel the prey rather than simply pursuing directly. She reaches a ravine and attempts to steal a canoe, triggering a bear trap in the process. The bear trap is another element of prepared landscape, another indication that Ben has seeded the terrain with his tools, that the apparent wilderness Sasha entered is in fact a kind of hunting ground that has been curated and prepared. Her injury from the bear trap changes the physical dynamics of what follows, introducing a limitation on her movement and capability that the film uses to shape the second act. Ben takes Sasha to a cave where the carcasses of many missing people are hidden. This is the film's most explicit horror adjacent moment, the revelation of the full scale of what Ben has done, the material evidence of a practice that has claimed many lives before Sasha's. The cave functions as both the practical storage of his crimes and their symbolic location, a dark, hidden, underground space where the evidence of what he has done is preserved, where the bodies of his victims exist in a state of grim testimony. The ranger's earlier warning about disappearances finds its explanation here. All those missing people in the region, they came here as Sasha has come, and Ben hunted them, and this cave is where they ended. Ben's revelation of himself. His explanation that he is a practitioner of cannibalistic tribal rituals, that consuming others keeps them alive in him, is delivered as a philosophical statement rather than an admission of guilt or an expression of shame. This is someone who has built a complete justification for what he does, a worldview in which his actions are not crimes but practices, not murders but rituals with a specific spiritual or philosophical meaning. The claim that consuming others keeps them alive in him is the kind of grotesque inversion of care and respect that characterizes a particular type of dangerous person. Someone who has taken a language of meaning and a purpose and bent it entirely to serve their own compulsions and appetites. It is worth noting that the film does not spend a great deal of time establishing the validity or coherence of Ben's philosophical framework, nor does it ask the audience to take it seriously as a genuine belief system. What matters is not whether Ben's philosophy is internally coherent or draws on any real tradition, but rather what it reveals about his character. A man who requires justification for what he does, who cannot simply acknowledge that his actions are predicated on power, control, and violence, but who needs to wrap them in the language of ritual and meaning. This need for justification, paradoxically, makes him more interesting and more frightening than a simple sadist would be. He is not simply cruel, he is someone who has constructed an elaborate edifice of self-justification around his cruelty. Sasha's response to her captivity, biting off Ben's ear, is both a practical act of self-defense and a symbolic one. In a film about a man who eats others, the woman who bites him is claiming a kind of agency within the terms he has established. She is not a passive victim waiting to be consumed. She is a person who can and will use her teeth, who will meet physical violence with physical violence of her own. The moment is viscerally satisfying in the way that moments of resistance in survival thrillers are designed to be. A release of the tension that has been building since Ben first brought out his crossbow, a demonstration that Sasha's capacity for self preservation has not been entirely suppressed by her grief. Managing to escape from her shackles and flee down the river, Sasha's path toward freedom is interrupted by the kind of setback that survival narratives depend upon. A steep drop knocks Ben unconscious, apparently resolving the threat, but he regains consciousness and overpowers her. The rhythm of near escapes and recaptures in survival thrillers is a structural convention of the genre, and Apex navigates it with reasonable skill, using each near escape to raise the tension by showing us that freedom is possible while demonstrating that it remains elusive. When Sasha fractures Ben's leg with a rock, the film shifts the physical dynamic between the two characters in a way that will drive the film's final act. The night scene in which Sasha recounts her guilt about letting Tommy fall is one of the film's most important moments, and it is where the film's thematic ambitions become most explicit. Here, in the darkness of the Australian wilderness, shackled to the man who has been hunting her, Sasha speaks about what has been driving her since the accident in Norway. The guilt she carries is not simply the ordinary grief of losing a spouse. It is a specifically agonizing form of guilt that comes from the belief that she had a choice, that in the moment when Tommy fell, she could have done something different, held on differently, or sacrificed herself in some way that might have saved him. Whether this belief is rational or irrational, whether it represents an accurate assessment of what was possible on that cliff in that storm, is almost beside the point. What matters is that she believes it, and that belief has been corrosive. This confession functions within the narrative in several ways. It is a moment of psychological exposure, of Sasha making herself vulnerable in a context where vulnerability is dangerous. And the fact that she is willing to do this, to open herself up in this way, even in these circumstances, suggests that the experience of being hunted has paradoxically stripped away some of the defensive armor that grief had built around her. When everything else has been taken away, when survival has been reduced to its most basic and urgent terms, the psychological defenses that we construct in ordinary life become both less necessary and less sustainable. Sasha is not choosing to confess. She is being forced into a kind of honesty by circumstances that have eliminated the usual alternatives. The compromise that follows, the very agreement between Sasha and Ben to conduct a tandem climb out of the ravine, is perhaps the film's most structurally audacious choice and also its thematic masterstroke. In order for Sasha to escape, she must climb with Ben. She must use the skills that she and Tommy developed together, the techniques of tandem climbing that the film established in its opening sequence as the defining practice of their relationship, and she must apply them in partnership with the man who hunted her. The Prusik knot she fashions to help Ben up the cliff is a piece of climbing technique, a friction hitch used to ascend a rope, but it is also an image of the terrible pragmatism that survival sometimes demands, the willingness to help the person who has tried to kill you because your survival depends on their survival. At least temporarily, the inversion is rich with meaning. Tandem climbing, as we saw in the opening sequence, is an act of profound mutual trust. Two people bound by a rope, each dependent on the other's skill and commitment to the shared upward project. What Sasha and Tommy had on the troll wall was a genuine partnership built on years of shared experience, shared risk, and shared passion. What Sasha and Ben have on this Australian cliff is a terrible parody of that partnership, a forced collaboration between hunter and prey in which the usual terms of trust and mutual dependence are replaced by calculation, desperation, and the knowledge that the agreement will not outlast the ascent. Ben promises to unshackle Sasha when they reach the top, and this promise is, of course, not one that either of them genuinely believes. The agreement they have reached is not a peace. It is a pause, a mutually convenient suspension of the hunt that will end when the immediate practical necessity that has created it is resolved. Both of them understand this. The climb is not a moment of connection or reconciliation. It is a continuation of the conflict by other means, a phase of the hunt in which the terrain has temporarily equalized things enough to force a tactical alliance. When Sasha stops at a ledge and discreetly loosens her harness, preparing in effect to accept the terms of their agreement, The film is in a genuinely suspenseful zone. She is making a unilateral decision to break the compact to sacrifice the safety of the harness for the freedom of being untethered from Ben. When Ben notices and tries to pull her off, her harness slips off and she removes the Prusik knot that has been holding him, sending him falling to his death below. The moral dimension of this moment is one the film does not try to simplify. Ben is a killer who has claimed many lives and who would certainly have killed Sasha. His death is not a tragedy in the conventional sense. But the manner of his death, Sasha's deliberate removal of the knot that was holding him, her active decision to let him fall, resonates with the film's opening sequence in a way that is clearly intentional. On the troll wall in Norway, Sasha let go of the rope that was holding Tommy and Tommy fell. On this Australian cliff, Sasha removes the knot that is holding Ben and Ben falls. The structural parallel is unmistakable and deeply meaningful. In one sense, Sasha is repeating the action that has haunted her. In another sense, she is transforming it, reclaiming it, recontextualizing it, turning an act that has felt like a failure and a betrayal into something decisive and intentional, act of will rather than an act of desperate necessity. This is the film's central emotional and thematic achievement. The suggestion that healing from guilt and grief is not a matter of resolution or explanation but of transformation, of finding a way to place the unbearable act in a new context that does not excuse it or erase it but gives it a different meaning. Sasha cannot undo what happened on the troll wall. She cannot know with certainty that she could not have saved Tommy. But she can perform a version of the same act, letting someone fall from a height when her own survival requires it, and find that when it is done with intention and clarity rather than desperate necessity, it feels different. It is not absolution. It is something more complicated and more real than absolution. The free climb that Sasha then undertakes, ascending the cliff without any gear, having shed her harness, is the film's final physical challenge and its most symbolic moment. Free climbing, as the film notes through an embedded reference to the practice, is climbing without protective equipment, relying entirely on one's own physical capability, judgment, and nerve. It is climbing in its most exposed and vulnerable form, the version of the practice that most clearly illustrates why human beings are drawn to vertical challenges in the first place. There is something in the act of ascending a cliff face with nothing between you and the void below but your own hands and feet and will that speaks to something essential about human existence. The fragility of it, the precariousness, and also the extraordinary tenacity that is possible when the alternative is unacceptable. Sasha reaches the summit. She has survived the hunt, she has survived her own grief, she has survived her guilt, or at least she has moved through it to a place where survival is possible. The journey from the troll wall to this Australian cliff top is not simply a physical journey or a survival story. It is a psychological and emotional journey from a woman who was not sure she deserved to survive to a woman who has claimed her survival with both hands, who has made active and deliberate choices in the service of her own life. The final sequences of the film are handled with appropriate restraint. Sasha walking through the forest in the dark and finding a car that rescues her is not dramatized as a moment of catharsis or extended emotional release. It is simply what happens next, the practical next step after the cliff, the return to the world of other people and vehicles and ranger stations. Her explanation to the authorities of where the missing people are, the subsequent excavation of bodies from Ben's cave are presented as procedural facts rather than dramatic set pieces. The film is not interested at this point in the machinery of justice or the institutional response to what has happened. It is interested in what comes after survival, in the small gesture with which Sasha marks the end of one phase of her life and the beginning of whatever comes next. That gesture is the throwing of Tommy's compass into the ocean. A compass is a navigational tool, an instrument that tells you which direction you are facing, that orients you in space. Tommy's compass has presumably been something Sasha has carried with her since his death, a physical object that maintains his presence in her life, that keeps her connected to him and to the identity they shared as climbers and as a couple. Throwing it into the water is not a rejection of Tommy or of her love for him. It is an act of release, an acknowledgement that she no longer needs the compass he carried, that she can find her own direction now, that the grief and guilt that have oriented her life since his death are not the only possible reference points. It is In its quietness and simplicity, one of the most emotionally effective moments in the film, Charlize Theron's performance as Sasha is the beating heart of Apex, and it represents exactly the kind of physically committed, emotionally layered work that has characterized her best performances across a remarkable career. Theron is one of the genuinely great actresses of her generation, someone who has consistently sought out roles that challenge her and that expand the range of what audiences expect from her. And her work in Apex is, in many respects, an extension of the physical and psychological territory she has been exploring for years. Born in Benoni, South Africa in 1975, Theron came to Hollywood with an early career that leaned into her physical beauty in ways that the industry reliably rewards. But she demonstrated from an early point a commitment to subverting expectations and pursuing complexity rather than comfort. Her Oscar winning performance as Eileen Wuornos in Monster in 2003 remains one of the most complete physical and psychological transformations in recent screen history, a performance that required both the willingness to radically alter her appearance and the ability to inhabit a psychology entirely unlike her own without condescension or simple sympathy. The performance won her the Academy Award for Best Actress and established her as someone willing to go to genuinely extreme places in the service of her work. In subsequent years, Theron has continued to pursue roles that challenge and complicate, from her work in Mad Max. Fury Road as the one-armed Imperator Furiosa, arguably the most iconic action performance by a woman in the history of the genre, to her deeply interior work in Young Adult and Tully, both directed by Jason Reitman, in which she played women wrestling with self-deception, disappointment, and the gap between who they wanted to be and who they are. She is also a producer, and her production company Denver and Delilah Productions has been involved in a number of significant projects, including the development of Apex, in which she served as both star and producer. Her involvement in Apex as a producer is significant because it gives us some insight into why this project attracted her. Theron has consistently sought out material that centers on women as active agents in their own stories, not as victims or supporting characters or love interests, but as protagonists whose inner lives and outer actions drive the narrative. Sasha is exactly this kind of protagonist, a woman whose story is entirely her own, whose choices, even the devastating choice on the troll wall, are the choices of an agent rather than a patient, and whose survival is a function of her own capability, determination, and intelligence rather than of rescue or luck. The physical demands of the role were considerable. Charlize Theron is known for approaching physical roles with rigorous preparation, and the climbing sequences in Apex, while aided by visual effects, stunt performers, and the full toolkit of contemporary production, required her to develop a credible physicality, a body language, and movement vocabulary that reads as genuinely belonging to an experienced climber. The way a person moves on rock, the way they read a cliff face and plan their route, the way they manage their breathing and their grip and their weight distribution, these are things that are not easily faked and that audiences with any familiarity with climbing will notice if they are not right. Taron Egerton's performance as Ben is, in its own way, at least as demanding as Theron's and perhaps more precisely calibrated. Ben is one of those villain characters that only works if the actor is willing to go fully into the darkness of what the character is without making him cartoonish or simply monstrous. Egerton, best known for his work as the title character in the Kingsman films and for his celebrated portrayal of Elton John in Rocketman, is perhaps a surprising choice for this role. His public persona leans toward warmth, charisma, and a kind of cheerful likability that is about as far from Ben as it is possible to get. This casting against type is, of course, entirely deliberate and functionally important to the film. Part of what makes Ben frightening is precisely that he does not read at first as a monster. His introduction at the service station, where he intervenes on Sasha's behalf against the aggressive hunters, establishes him as someone who can present a socially acceptable face, who knows how to perform normalcy and even kindness when it serves his purposes. Egerton's natural warmth is weaponized in this context. His ability to make Ben seem approachable and even sympathetic in his early interactions with Sasha is what makes the revelation of his true nature so effective and so unsettling. When the mask drops, When Ben brings out the crossbow and the stereo and reveals himself as what he is, Egerton does not simply pivot to a different performance mode. He allows the revelation to feel like a continuation of what was already there, a deeper layer of the same personality rather than an entirely different person. This is the right choice because the most frightening thing about Ben is not that he has a monstrous self hidden behind a normal one, but that the monstrous self and the seemingly normal one are aspects of the same coherent psychology. A psychology that is internally consistent even if it is entirely aberrant by any external standard. Egerton joined the cast in November 2024, relatively late in the development process, which suggests that the casting of the villain was handled with particular care. The role of Ben is physically demanding as well as psychologically complex. The climbing sequences in the film's final act required Egerton to work credibly in a vertical environment, and the late addition of a performer of his caliber suggests that the filmmakers were willing to wait for the right actor rather than fill the role with someone less suited to its demands. Eric Bana's role as Tommy is structurally limited. The character dies in the opening sequence and appears subsequently only in whatever form Tommy's memory and presence occupy in Sasha's consciousness. But it is nonetheless an important one. Bana, the Australian actor best known internationally for his work in films like Chopper, Black Hawk Down, Munich, and Troy, brings an authenticity and gravity to Tommy that makes his loss feel genuinely significant rather than simply functional. The fact that Bana is Australian adds an additional layer of resonance to the film's Australian setting, a connection between the actor and the landscape that is perhaps coincidental but feels meaningful. Bana joined the cast in January 2025 after principal photography in Sydney and the Blue Mountains had already been scheduled, and his relatively brief screen time means that his contribution to the film is concentrated in the opening sequence and in whatever memories and echoes of his presence the film develops in its second and third acts. The performance of a character who exists primarily as an absence, as a presence that has been removed and whose removal has shaped everything that follows, requires a particular kind of skill, the ability to make an impression that will sustain the film's emotional logic long after the character has physically disappeared from the screen. Matt Whelan appears as one of the hunters in what is essentially a supporting role that establishes a specific atmospheric context and functions as a narrative misdirection, pointing the audience toward a more conventional type of threat before the film reveals the much more specific and sophisticated danger that Ben represents. Whelan's presence in the cast is consistent with the film's commitment to assembling genuinely capable performers even in relatively minor roles. The production of Apex presents a fascinating case study in the challenges and opportunities of contemporary international filmmaking, particularly as it operates through the Netflix model of global distribution and platform-specific production. Principal photography began in Sydney and around the Blue Mountains of New South Wales, Australia in February 2025, a period when the Australian production industry was in a strong position to host major international productions, supported by a combination of favorable exchange rates, world-class technical infrastructure, and a landscape of extraordinary visual richness and variety. The Blue Mountains are one of the most dramatically beautiful regions of New South Wales, a vast sandstone plateau deeply incised by rivers and creeks into a series of gorgeous cliffs and valleys that present a landscape of enormous visual power. The region is named for the blue haze that hangs over its forests of eucalyptus trees, an optical phenomenon caused by the fine droplets of eucalyptus oil that the trees release into the air, which scatter the blue wavelengths of sunlight more than other colors, creating the characteristic coloring that gives the mountains their name. This landscape is ancient and strange, a place that carries a different quality of time and space than the landscapes of Europe or North America, and it is visually about as far as it is possible to get from the cold vertical drama of a Norwegian cliff face. The decision to film in Australia was not simply a logistical convenience or a financial one, though Australia's production incentives and experienced crew base would have been relevant considerations. The landscape itself is integral to the film's meaning, contributing to the atmosphere of isolation, danger, and the sense of a landscape that is indifferent to human survival. Australian wilderness has a particular quality in this regard. It is often beautiful, but it is a beauty that does not comfort, a landscape that does not offer the kind of picturesque sublimity of, say, a Swiss mountain or a Scottish highland, but rather a more austere, more ancient, more unsettling beauty that can make a person feel very small and very alone. The cinematography was handled by Lawrence Sher, whose work across a varied career includes projects ranging from the Joker films to the War Dogs and Game Night comedies, demonstrating a flexibility of visual approach that serves the specific demands of each project rather than imposing a single visual signature. For Apex, Cher's work needed to balance the physical realism of the outdoor survival sequences with the more heightened expressionistic qualities of the thriller genre, finding a visual register that could make the Australian landscape feel both documentary real and cinematically charged. The landscapes needed to be beautiful in a way that was also threatening, inviting in a way that was also hostile, legible enough that the audience could follow the spatial logic of the chase while also preserving something of the genuine disorientation that the wild can produce. The editing was handled by Sigurdur Eithorson, who worked on several of Cormacour's earlier films and whose relationship with the director spans a significant portion of both their careers. The editorial relationship between a director and an editor is one of the most intimate and important creative partnerships in filmmaking, and the familiarity that Aithosan and Kormakar have developed through previous collaborations would have been particularly valuable on a film like Apex, where the pacing of the survival sequences, the management of tension, the calibration of when to show and when to withhold the rhythm of near escapes and recaptures is crucial to the film's effectiveness. A survival thriller that is edited too loosely loses tension. One that is edited too tightly loses the sense of landscape and space that gives the peril its physical reality. Getting this balance right requires precise judgment, and the Aithoson Kormakar partnership was well placed to achieve it. The musical score was composed by Høgni Egilson, an Icelandic musician and composer whose work spans both the world of popular music. He is known as Høgni and has had a career as a recording artist and film composition. The choice of an Icelandic composer for a film directed by an Icelandic director is not surprising, but it is also not simply a matter of cultural loyalty. Icelandic music has developed a distinctive character over the last 2 decades, partly through the international success of bands and artists who have drawn on the landscape and light conditions of the island to develop a sound that is austere, atmospheric, and often marked by a quality of melancholy that is simultaneously desolate and beautiful. This sonic sensibility, which one might characterize as the musical equivalent of the quality of Icelandic light, which is stark and revealing and carries enormous distances, is a natural fit for a film like Apex, which is fundamentally about exposure, about the stripping away of protection and pretense to reveal something essential. Egilson's score would need to navigate several distinct moods across the film's 95 minutes. The elevated, wind-scored drama of the Norwegian opening, the quieter melancholy of Sasha's solo journey into the Australian wilderness, the building tension of the hunting sequences, and the physical and emotional intensity of the climbing finale. It would also need to serve the film's thematic concerns without being too explicitly illustrative. A score that too obviously tells the audience how to feel about what is happening on screen reduces the emotional complexity that the screenplay and performances are working to create. The visual effects work on Apex was extensive and involved several major companies with strong track records in both creature and environmental effects. Framestore, who had previously worked with Cormaker on both Beast and Everest, contributed to the film, bringing their expertise in digitally created and enhanced environments to bear on the sequences where the Australian landscape needed to be extended, heightened, or otherwise augmented. The involvement of Industrial Light and Magic, the legendary VFX company founded by George Lucas and responsible for some of the most significant advances in digital filmmaking over the past 4 decades, alongside Rising Sun Pictures, Union VFX, and Host VFX, suggests a production that used visual effects in a comprehensive and integrated way. The visual effects supervisor was Enric Pavdeja, who had previously worked with Framestore on Beast in the same capacity and who brought an established relationship with Cormaker's working methods to the project. The producer of visual effects was Gavin Round. The integration of visual effects in a survival thriller presents specific challenges that are different from those of, say, a superhero film or a science fiction production. In a survival thriller, the visual effects need to be invisible or nearly so. They should enhance and extend the reality of what is being shot rather than create something visibly artificial, because the credibility of the film's physical jeopardy depends on the audience believing that what they are seeing is real. A survival thriller in which the cliff faces are obviously digital or the environment is clearly constructed is a film that loses its grip on the audience's nervous system, because the fear response that the genre depends on is predicated on a sense of genuine physical reality. Forsto's contribution to Apex was particularly significant in this regard, given the company's extensive experience in environmental digital work and their established relationship with Cormacor. The Troll Wall opening sequence, shot in Norway or augmented to represent Norway, would have required particular care. The Troll Walls is sufficiently well known to dedicated climbing audiences that inaccurate representation would be immediately apparent, while the need for camera positions and dramatic angles that would be impossible or extremely dangerous to achieve with a camera physically present on the rock face means that digital augmentation was essential. The British Board of Film Classification gave Apex a 15 certificate, which was issued on April 23rd, 2026, the day before the film's Netflix release. This rating in the UK context indicates content that is not suitable for children under 15, typically involving significant violence, strong language, or disturbing thematic content. The cannibalism element of Ben's character, the cave of corpses, and the violence of the hunting sequences would all have been relevant considerations in arriving at this rating. The 15 certificate is a familiar marker for survival thrillers of this kind. It allows the film to include the levels of threat and violence necessary for genuine tension without pushing into the territory of graphic content that would earn an 18 certificate and significantly narrow the potential audience. Netflix released Apex globally on April 21st, 2026, making it simultaneously available to subscribers in over 190 countries. This release model, a single global day and date release to streaming, is the standard Netflix approach for its original film content and represents one of the most significant structural differences between the platform and the traditional theatrical distribution model. For a film like Apex, which belongs to a genre with consistent global appeal, the Netflix release model offers certain advantages. It eliminates the risk of box office underperformance in theatrical release. It makes the film available to an enormous potential audience immediately. And it sidesteps the challenges of managing a theatrical rollout across different markets with different release date conventions and competitive landscapes. At the same time, the streaming release model has implications for how films are experienced and discussed. The theatrical experience, seeing a film in a darkened room with a large screen and a high quality sound system, surrounded by other audience members, creates a specific context for engagement that is very different from watching on a laptop or a television at home. For survival thrillers in particular, the theatrical experience has historically been important because the genre's effectiveness depends significantly on the physical, almost bodily experience of tension and fear that a properly calibrated theatrical presentation can produce. Whether the impact of Apex's survival sequences is fully available to someone watching on a laptop is a genuine question, one that touches on broader debates about the relationship between streaming and theatrical exhibition that have been ongoing throughout the 2020s. The film's critical reception was mixed, which is perhaps unsurprising for a genre film that is attempting something more ambitious than simple genre entertainment, without fully resolving all the tensions that ambition creates. On Rotten Tomatoes, 65% of 74 critics' reviews were positive, a figure that places the film in the territory of a qualified success. More critical endorsement than rejection, but not the kind of near universal enthusiasm that marks a genuine critical breakthrough. The Metacritic score of 57 out of 100 based on 21 critics indicates a critical consensus of mixed or average reviews, a score that reflects the genuine disagreement among critics about the film's merits and limitations. The positive critical response to Apex tended to focus on several consistent elements. Charlize Theron's performance which was widely recognized as one of the film's genuine strengths. Baltasar Kormakor's direction, and specifically his command of landscape and physical tension, and the film's ambition in using the survival thriller framework to explore themes of grief and guilt rather than simply delivering genre thrills. The negative critical response conversely tended to focus on the film's pacing, with some critics finding the middle section, the period of captivity, and the uneasy alliance between Sasha and Ben slower or less propulsive than the film's opening and closing acts, and on what some reviewers characterized as an insufficiently developed relationship between the film's genre mechanics and its thematic concerns. These are legitimate criticisms that touch on real tensions in the film's construction. Apex is attempting to do two things simultaneously: deliver the genre satisfactions of a survival thriller, the physical tension, the close calls, the resourcefulness of the protagonist, the cat and mouse dynamic, while also exploring something more psychologically and emotionally complex. Managing these two imperatives is difficult, and there are moments in the film where the balance tips one way or the other, where the psychological depth comes at the cost of narrative momentum, or where the demands of genre pacing leave insufficient time for the internal drama to develop fully. The question of whether the film succeeds in holding these elements together is one on which reasonable viewers can disagree, and the split critical response reflects the genuine complexity of that question. What the critical discussion of Apex tends to agree on, even where overall assessments differ, is that the film is a serious attempt to do something meaningful within the constraints of a commercial genre framework, and that it achieves a good deal of what it sets out to do, even if it does not entirely fulfill its ambitions. This is a more interesting and more valuable critical position than either dismissal or uncritical enthusiasm, and it suggests a film that will repay closer attention and repeated viewing in ways that simpler genre entertainments typically do not. The film's place within Baltasar Kormaker's body of work is also worth considering carefully. Kormakar has now made several films that could be grouped together as a loose cycle of survival narratives: The Deep, Everest, Beast, and now Apex, each exploring the relationship between human beings and extreme environments through the lens of a different kind of threat or challenge. What these films share beyond their surface level genre identity is a consistent philosophical stance, a respect for nature's indifference, a skepticism about human claims of mastery over the natural world, and an interest in what extreme physical challenges reveal about character and the human will. The Deep, based on a true story, explored survival as something close to a miracle. The extraordinary physiological fact of a man who survived conditions that should have killed him, and the psychological aftermath of that survival. Everest explored the catastrophic consequences of underestimating the mountain, the ways in which ambition and overconfidence can be fatal in environments where there is no margin for error. Beast explored the specific terror of being hunted by a non human predator in a landscape where the human assumption of being at the top of the food chain was suddenly and violently challenged. Apex combines elements of all of these earlier films: the survival miracle of the deep, the vertical drama of Everest, the hunted by predator dynamic of Beast, while adding a specifically human antagonist whose danger is philosophical and psychological as well as physical. In a sense, Ben represents the most sophisticated and disturbing predator Kormakar has yet created, not because a cannibal is objectively more frightening than a rogue lion, but because a human predator requires a different kind of response than an animal one. Against a lion, the response is purely physical and instinctive. Against Ben, Sasha must also engage psychologically and philosophically, must understand what he is and why he does what he does in order to find the gap in his armor. The film also reflects Kormaker's continued development as a director of actors. His earlier films showed consistent technical skill in managing performance within challenging physical environments, but his later work has developed a greater interest in the interior lives of characters, in using the physical extreme as a context for psychological revelation. This development is consistent with a maturing directorial sensibility, a filmmaker who began with strong instincts for visual storytelling and physical tension, and who has gradually developed a deeper interest in character and psychology without abandoning his core visual and kinetic strengths. Jeremy Robbins, the screenwriter of Apex, is a writer whose spec script acquisition by Netflix represents a significant career moment. The spec script market, writers crafting screenplays on speculation without a prior commission, has contracted significantly in the contemporary Hollywood landscape as studios and platforms have increasingly focused their development on adaptations of existing IP, sequels, and franchise extensions, and projects developed through direct commission. In this environment, the sale of a high concept original spec to a major platform is a notable achievement, and the subsequent production of that spec with the creative team that Apex assembled suggests that the script's fundamental qualities were sufficiently compelling to survive the development process intact. What is apparent from the film's execution is that Robbins' screenplay had a strong structural foundation. The parallel between the Norwegian opening and the Australian finale, the use of Ben's philosophical framework as a way of exploring larger questions about consumption and ritual, the specific choice of climbing as the protagonist's defining skill, and that these structural choices gave the director and performers a solid base on which to build. A screenplay that was simply a series of survival sequences would not have attracted the creative talent that Apex assembled. What would have attracted Theron, Egerton, Cormaker, and the other significant talents involved was the sense that there was something worth exploring beneath the surface of the genre. The film's treatment of cannibalism deserves some specific attention because it is a narrative element that carries enormous cultural weight and that the film handles with a degree of restraint that is both appropriate and interesting. Cannibalism has been a recurring theme in horror and thriller cinema, from The Silence of the Lambs and its various sequels and spin offs through to more recent entries in the genre, and it carries a particular cultural charge because it represents the most absolute transgression of the boundary between the self and the other, the most radical and disturbing form of the violation of bodily integrity. That Ben frames his cannibalistic practice in terms of ritual and spiritual meaning. The claim that consuming others keeps them alive in him is an attempt to give a philosophical veneer to what is, at its most basic, a horror. The film is wise not to take Ben's philosophical framework at face value or to present it as genuinely coherent. His claims about tribal ritual and the preservation of consumed others within him are presented as the self justifying mythology of a dangerous person, not as an authentic alternative worldview deserving of serious consideration. At the same time, the film is not interested in reducing Ben simply to a monster or a madman. He is dangerous and wrong, but he is also human. Human in his need for justification, human in his elaborate construction of meaning around his violence, human in the moments of the film where his injury and vulnerability create something that almost resembles pathos. This complexity is uncomfortable and it is meant to be. The relationship between Apex and the broader tradition of the hunt as narrative in film and literature is also worth exploring. The story of a human being hunted by another human being, the hunter becoming the hunted, has been a recurring narrative template across centuries of storytelling from ancient myths through to contemporary cinema. Richard Connell's 1924 short story The Most Dangerous Game, in which a big game hunter is himself hunted by a deranged Russian aristocrat, is perhaps the most influential single version of this template in 20th century popular culture, and its influence can be traced through numerous film and television adaptations and derivatives. The template speaks to something deep in the human experience of danger and power, the terror of being reduced from subject to object, from hunter to prey, from agent to quarry. Apex engages with this tradition while also significantly complicating it. In the Connell tradition, the hunted protagonist is typically someone who has already been a hunter. The irony of the hunter becoming the prey is central to the moral structure of the story. Sasha is not a hunter, she is a climber, someone who engages with the natural world through a different kind of challenge, one that is fundamentally collaborative with a partner with the rock itself rather than predatory. The choice to make the protagonist a climber rather than a hunter is a meaningful departure from the template because it means that Sasha's survival strategies draw on a different repertoire of skills and a different philosophical relationship to risk and the natural world. The film's gender dynamics are also significant and worth examining. Apex is fundamentally a film about a woman surviving a man's attempt to hunt her, and this dynamic carries resonances that extend well beyond the immediate narrative. The survival thriller genre has historically been dominated by male protagonists, with female protagonists either absent or figured as victims to be rescued. The movement of recent decades toward female protagonists in action and survival genres, represented by films like Gravity, The Revenant's female centered variation, Edge of Tomorrow, and the Mad Max franchise, reflects both changing cultural attitudes toward gender and the commercial realization that female audiences respond strongly to female protagonists in traditionally male dominated genres. Charlize Theron's track record in this space is relevant here. Her performance as Furiosa in Mad Max Fury Road established her as one of the defining female action heroes of contemporary cinema, and her subsequent roles have consistently sought out female protagonists who are defined by their agency, capability, and moral complexity rather than by their relationship to male characters. Sasha in Apex is a continuation of this trajectory. A woman whose story is entirely her own, whose choices drive the narrative, and who survives through her own capability rather than through rescue or luck. The film's setting in Australia adds another layer of cultural and historical resonance to the narrative. Australia as a landscape carries particular meanings in the cultural imagination. It is a place of ancient geological time, of a complexity and strangeness that European settlers have historically found disorienting, of indigenous cultures with deep relationships to the land that were disrupted and damaged by colonization. The Australian wilderness that features in the film is not a neutral setting. It is a landscape with history, with meaning, with the weight of what has happened in and to it. The film does not engage directly with this history. It is not that kind of film, but the landscape itself carries it, and a viewer attentive to what Australian wilderness means in cultural and historical terms will bring those resonances to their experience of the film. The Blue Mountains, specifically, have a particular place in Australian cultural history. For the early European colonizers of the continent, the Blue Mountains represented a barrier that took more than 2 decades to cross after the establishment of the first European settlement at Sydney Cove in 1788. The crossing of the Blue Mountains in 1813 by Blaxland, Wentworth, and Lawson was a pivotal moment in the expansion of European settlement into the interior of the continent, opening up the Great Plains to the west. The mountains thus carry the weight of colonial history as well as their natural beauty and dramatic landscape. And this history, even if largely unacknowledged in the film, is part of the atmosphere that the setting creates. The production context of Apex reflects several significant trends in contemporary film production and distribution that are worth examining for what they reveal about the state of the industry in 2025 and 2026. The Netflix model of acquiring rights to spec scripts, attaching major filmmakers and stars, and producing for direct streaming release represents one of the dominant modes of prestige genre filmmaking in the current era, and Apex is a textbook example of how this model operates. The acquisition of the Robin screenplay in February 2024 for an unspecified amount, described in industry reporting as a spec acquisition, would have been a significant financial commitment. Spec scripts that attract the attention of major platforms are typically priced at a premium, and the bidding for a high concept original spec with strong commercial potential can be competitive. The attachment of Ian Bryce and Chernin Entertainment as producers, both significant names in commercial Hollywood filmmaking, and the subsequent attachment of Charlize Theron as star and producer, followed by the engagement of Baltasar Kormaker as director, would each have been stages in a development process that took the project from a piece of paper to a fully assembled production. Ian Bryce is one of the most experienced producers in Hollywood, with credits that include the Transformers franchise and numerous other major commercial productions. His involvement in Apex signals that the project was conceived from the beginning as a high-quality, commercially ambitious production rather than a prestige art film or a niche genre entry. Chernin Entertainment, founded by Peter Chernin, has a strong track record of developing and producing commercially successful genre films, including the Planet of the Apes reboot series. The combination of these producing partners with a director of Cormacour's prestige and artistic credibility represents exactly the kind of creative and commercial alliance that distinguishes the most successful Netflix original films from more generic platform content. The film's international co-production structure, involving the United States, the United Kingdom, and Iceland, reflects the increasingly global nature of major film production and the specific cultural geography of the creative team assembled for Apex. Cormacor's Icelandic production company AVK Studios co-produced the film, reflecting the director's continuing investment in Icelandic cinema infrastructure even as his work extends increasingly into international productions. The UK involvement reflects Taron Egerton's nationality and possibly also the involvement of UK based production partners. The choice to begin principal photography in February 2025 rather than earlier in 2024 or 2025 suggests that the film's development process from initial acquisition through script development and casting to production preparation moved at a relatively measured pace. The January 2025 announcement of Eric Bana's casting came only weeks before the start of principal photography, which raises interesting questions about when the character of Tommy was finalized in the screenplay and whether his role was always conceived as appearing primarily in the film's opening sequence or whether the scope of his presence changed during development. The film was shot primarily in Sydney and the Blue Mountains, with the opening Norwegian sequence presumably shot either on location in Norway, with the troll wall providing its extraordinary visual backdrop, or in a combination of location footage and studio work augmented by visual effects. The troll wall is one of the most photographed rock faces in the world, and its distinctive visual character is familiar enough to be recognizable, which creates both an opportunity and a challenge. The opportunity to leverage an iconic location's visual power and the challenge of doing justice to something that the audience may already know. The production design and costume work on Apex, elements not specifically credited in the available information but crucial to the film's overall effectiveness, would have faced the challenge of creating a visual world that feels authentic to the extreme outdoor environments being depicted. Climbers' gear, wilderness survival equipment, the specific clothing and tools that Sasha and Ben each carry and use. All of these needed to be researched, sourced, and deployed with sufficient accuracy that the film's physical world would be credible to audiences with direct experience of outdoor pursuits, while also being legible and visually interesting to general audiences for whom this world is less familiar. The film's release on April 24, 2026 placed it in a specific moment in the streaming landscape, arriving at a time when Netflix was continuing to invest heavily in original genre films while also navigating an increasingly competitive market in which other platforms had developed their own significant slates of original content. The spring release window is typically less competitive than the summer blockbuster season or the autumn award season rush, and releasing Apex in late April gave the film room to make an impact without being immediately overwhelmed by the competition of major theatrical releases. The first look images from the film, released in December 2025 through People magazine, showed Charlize Theron in the wilderness setting of the film and gave audiences their first visual sense of the production's aesthetic approach. These images generate significant media coverage and social media discussion, reflecting both the general enthusiasm for a new Charlize Theron action vehicle and the specific interest in seeing Theron and Egerton together in an antagonistic relationship rather than the collaborative or romantic context in which stars of their caliber are typically paired. The marketing of Apex by Netflix would have faced the challenge that all streaming original films face, generating awareness and anticipation for a film that will not have the extended build-up of a theatrical release campaign, with its trailers in cinemas, outdoor advertising, and the months of sustained attention that a major theatrical release generates. Netflix has developed sophisticated marketing strategies for its original films, leveraging its platform itself as a marketing vehicle, surfacing upcoming releases to subscribers who have shown relevant viewing patterns, using data about what its users watch to target promotional content effectively. while also maintaining a presence in traditional media through press coverage, interviews, and social media. Looking at Apex as a whole, as a completed work of commercial cinema with specific artistic ambitions, one is struck by the coherence of its central conceit and the skill with which its most important sequences, the Norwegian opening, the service station encounter with Ben, the cave revelation, the night confession, and the final climb are executed. The film has genuine strengths that distinguish it from generic survival thrillers, and these strengths are primarily rooted in the quality of the creative team assembled to make it. Kormakur's command of landscape and physical tension, Theron's performance of grief and survival, Egerton's precisely calibrated portrayal of a man who has made his violence into a philosophy. The film is less successful in certain areas. The middle section during the period of captivity and the forced alliance asks the audience to sustain engagement across a stretch of narrative that is inherently less kinetically propulsive than the hunting sequences before it, and the management of pace in this section requires a degree of trust in the psychological and emotional material that not all viewers will be willing to extend. The character of Ben, while effectively performed by Egerton, is perhaps not given sufficient depth by the screenplay to fully sustain the demands placed on him as both a physical threat and a philosophical antagonist. And the final sequences, which resolve the external danger with relative efficiency, before moving to the quiet emotional conclusion of Tommy's compass being thrown into the sea, may leave viewers who came for genre thrills feeling that the film has shifted registers too abruptly. But these limitations, real as they are, do not significantly diminish the film's achievement. Apex is a survival thriller that takes its protagonist's inner life as seriously as her physical survival, that uses the language and conventions of the genre to explore something genuinely meaningful about grief, guilt, and the complicated human relationship to the choices that define us. In a landscape of streaming content in which quantity of production can sometimes work against the careful attention that genuinely ambitious filmmaking requires, Apex represents a real commitment to quality and seriousness that deserves recognition even where the film falls short of its most ambitious aspirations. The film's legacy is still being formed, as is the case for any film released only weeks ago at the time of this writing. Whether Apex will become recognized as one of the significant films of its year, or whether it will settle into the category of well regarded streaming genre entertainment that generates strong viewing numbers and positive audience response without quite achieving the cultural footprint of the most memorable entries in the survival thriller genre, remains to be seen. What can be said with confidence is that it represents serious and skilled work by all of the major creative talents involved, and that its central performance by Charlize Theron is the kind of committed, physically demanding, emotionally complex work that defines a career. For Baltasar Kormákur, Apex represents a consolidation of the themes and concerns that have defined his best work over more than 2 decades of filmmaking. He remains one of the most distinctive voices in international commercial cinema, a filmmaker who brings a specifically Icelandic sensibility, shaped by a culture that has always lived in intimate relationship with extreme environments and with the constant awareness of nature's overwhelming indifference, to stories that resonate globally. His collaboration with Netflix represents a productive alignment of a filmmaker with specific and distinctive strengths and a platform with the resources and appetite to support ambitious genre filmmaking. For Charlize Theron, Apex adds to an already extraordinary body of work another chapter in her ongoing exploration of female protagonists who face extreme challenges with intelligence, physical capability, and emotional depth. Her continued willingness to develop projects through her production company rather than simply waiting for roles to be offered to her speaks to a creative ambition and a clarity of purpose that has consistently distinguished her career from those of performers content to be reactive rather than generative in their relationship to the material they take on. For Taron Egerton, the role of Ben represents a significant departure from the more warmly received characters that have defined his public identity, a deliberate choice to work against type in the service of a dramatically demanding role. The degree to which this gamble pays off, the degree to which the casting of Egerton as a villain enriches the film by bringing his specific qualities to bear in an unexpected context, is one of the more interesting questions that Apex raises about casting, genre, and the relationship between a performer's established persona and the roles they choose to inhabit. And for the audience that comes to Apex through the Netflix platform from any of the 190 plus countries in which it is available, the film offers something that the most successful genre cinema has always offered: the opportunity to test one's own responses to extreme situations through the safe proxy of a fictional character's experience, to feel the fear and the desperation and the fierce determination to survive, and to emerge from the experience with some sense, however elusive and difficult to fully articulate, of what one's own capacity for endurance and agency might be. This is the oldest purpose of storytelling, and survival narratives engage with it in their most direct and visceral form. Apex, at its best, fulfills this purpose with intelligence and skill, and for that, it deserves to be remembered as more than simply another entry in a crowded genre. The fact that the film takes its title, Apex, from the ecological concept of the apex predator, the creature at the top of the food chain that has no natural predators of its own, is a final detail worth unpacking. Ben considers himself an apex predator, the ultimate hunter, the being at the top of the chain in the landscape he has made his hunting ground. But the film suggests, through its narrative, that the designation of apex predator is not fixed or guaranteed, that the hierarchy of the hunt can be inverted, that the predator can become prey. Sasha, by the end of the film, has claimed the apex position that Ben arrogated to himself. She has survived the hunter, she has let him fall, she has climbed to the summit. She has reached her own apex, not as a predator but as a survivor, which is, the film ultimately argues, the more durable and the more meaningful achievement. In a world that often celebrates dominance and the ability to destroy, Apex offers a quieter but more profound form of triumph. The survival of the person who was not supposed to survive, the resilience of the person whose grief and guilt had already made her feel that survival was more than she deserved. That Sasha reaches the top of the cliff and then walks through the dark forest and finds the road back is not simply a genre resolution. It is a statement about the human capacity to endure, not in spite of the weight we carry, but sometimes paradoxically because of it. The weight of Tommy's death, the guilt of letting him go, has in some sense driven Sasha up every cliff she has faced since Norway. It drove her into the Australian wilderness. And in the end, it drove her up the cliff from which she sent her hunter falling. The compass that she throws into the sea at the end is not Tommy's absence. It is the specific shape of her grief, the turning, the inability to settle on a direction, the sense of being lost. What she keeps is everything else, and that Apex suggests is enough to begin again. The wilderness does not forgive weakness, it does not care about grief, fear, or survival. In Apex, the mountains, forests, rivers, and caves become more terrifying than any monster because they expose what human beings truly become when survival is the only thing left. The film transforms a simple survival story into a brutal psychological nightmare where trust disappears, morality collapses, and every step deeper into nature feels like walking toward death itself. Apex is not just a thriller about escaping danger. It is a film about endurance, trauma, and the terrifying instinct to stay alive no matter the cost. Released in 2026, Apex quickly became one of the most discussed survival thrillers of the year because of its intense atmosphere, grounded performances, and physically demanding action. Directed by Baltasar Kormakur, the movie combines psychological tension with harsh environmental realism, creating an experience that feels raw and exhausting rather than polished and glamorous. Charlize Theron leads the film with one of her most physically committed performances, while Taron Egerton delivers a disturbing and unpredictable antagonist performance that shocked many viewers who were used to seeing him in more charismatic heroic roles. The development of Apex began years before production officially started. The screenplay was written with the intention of creating a stripped down survival thriller focused more on tension and atmosphere than on complicated mythology or excessive exposition. The original script gained attention because it understood how effective simplicity can be when handled correctly. A woman enters the wilderness seeking emotional healing and instead becomes trapped inside a deadly hunt. The idea itself sounds straightforward, but the emotional execution and environmental storytelling gave the project its unique identity. Producers immediately recognized the cinematic potential of the concept. Survival thrillers have always attracted audiences because they tap into primal fears. Apex pushed that idea further by combining physical survival with emotional collapse. The wilderness in the film is not simply a setting. It becomes a psychological prison where isolation magnifies every fear and every mistake. Baltasar Kormakur was eventually chosen to direct the project because of his experience with survival focused storytelling. His previous films often explored the relationship between human beings and unforgiving natural environments. He understood how to make weather, mountains, water, and isolation feel genuinely threatening. Instead of directing Apex like a traditional action film, he approached it as a physical and emotional experience. From the beginning, Kormakar wanted realism to dominate the movie's visual style. He believed audiences would only connect emotionally if the danger felt authentic. That philosophy influenced nearly every creative decision during production, from location selection to stunt work and cinematography. Casting Charlize Theron as the lead was one of the most important decisions in the entire production process. Theron had already established herself as one of Hollywood's strongest action performers through years of physically demanding roles, but Apex required a very different type of performance. This was not a sleek spice thriller where the protagonist always remained in control. The character in Apex needed to look vulnerable, exhausted, frightened, injured, and emotionally shattered while still convincing audiences she could survive. Theron reportedly connected deeply with the emotional core of the script. Her character enters the wilderness carrying grief and emotional trauma, hoping isolation will help her recover. Instead, the environment forces her into a brutal survival situation that strips away every emotional defense she has built. The role demanded both physical endurance and emotional vulnerability. To prepare for the movie, Theron trained extensively in climbing, wilderness movement, running, and survival techniques. She spent months building the physical stamina necessary for the role because much of the film depends on believable exhaustion. The character spends large portions of the movie running through forests, climbing cliffs, swimming through dangerous water, crawling through caves, and fighting through injuries. What makes Theron's performance so effective is how physical it feels. She does not move like an invincible action hero. She struggles constantly. Her breathing becomes heavier. Her movements slow down. Fear becomes visible in her face and body language. That realism makes the danger feel immediate throughout the film. Taron Egerton's casting surprised many audiences at first, but it ultimately became one of the movie's greatest strengths. Egerton had built much of his career around energetic, charming, and emotionally warm characters. Apex uses that audience familiarity in clever ways. Early scenes reportedly allow him to appear approachable and trustworthy before revealing something far darker underneath. Egerton embraced the darker material completely. His performance relies heavily on unpredictability. Instead of portraying the antagonist as openly monstrous from the beginning, he creates an unsettling atmosphere through small behavioral details, strange moments of calmness, and sudden emotional shifts. That unpredictability makes the character terrifying because viewers never fully understand what he might do next. Eric Bana joined the cast as another key supporting presence. Bana brought natural intensity and realism to the project, helping ground the story emotionally. His experience with dramatic thrillers added additional weight to the film's performances. Supporting actors including Caitlin Stacey and several Australian performers helped create a believable world filled with suspicion and danger. Once casting was finalized, production moved to Australia, where the filmmakers searched for locations capable of delivering both beauty and terror. The Blue Mountains region and surrounding wilderness areas became central filming locations because of their dramatic cliffs, dense forests, caves, rivers, and isolated landscapes. The decision to film in real wilderness environments dramatically shaped the movie's final tone. Instead of depending entirely on studio sets or digital backgrounds, Kormakar wanted the actors physically interacting with harsh natural conditions. Mud, rain, unstable terrain, freezing water, and steep cliffs became genuine obstacles during filming. Production reports described extremely difficult shooting conditions. Some locations required long hikes carrying equipment through dangerous terrain. Certain cave sequences forced cast and crew members into cramped spaces with limited movement. Water scenes reportedly involved freezing temperatures that pushed performers physically and mentally. Kormakor believed these uncomfortable conditions would help create authentic performances, and the results are visible throughout the film. Characters look genuinely exhausted because the environment itself challenged the actors constantly. Sweat, dirt, bruises, wet clothing, and physical strain appear naturally on screen instead of feeling artificially designed. One of the most impressive aspects of Apex is its visual storytelling. The cinematography constantly shifts between beauty and horror. Wide landscape shots initially make the wilderness appear peaceful and liberating, but as danger grows, those same environments become threatening and suffocating. Forests feel endless, cliffs feel deadly, rivers feel impossible to cross safely. Natural lighting played a major role in achieving realism. Sunlight filtering through trees, cold nighttime shadows, misty mornings, and harsh daylight all contribute to the film's atmosphere. Rather than presenting Australia as a glamorous tourist destination, the movie portrays it as unpredictable and indifferent to human survival. The caves became especially memorable locations within the movie. Several sequences trap characters inside narrow underground spaces filled with darkness and uncertainty. These scenes create intense claustrophobia because viewers can almost feel the lack of air and movement. The sound design inside these caves amplifies every breath, every footstep, and every moment of panic. Although the movie heavily emphasized practical environments, visual effects still played an important supporting role. Digital effects enhanced landscapes, environmental continuity, weather elements, and dangerous sequences while remaining mostly invisible to audiences. The filmmakers wanted the movie to feel real rather than digitally exaggerated. The action style in Apex differs significantly from modern blockbuster filmmaking. Instead of non stop explosions or overly choreographed combat, the film focuses on endurance and desperation. Characters fight awkwardly, panic under pressure, and make mistakes. Survival often depends less on strength than on quick thinking and adaptability. Many sequences build tension through silence rather than loud music or constant editing. The movie understands how frightening uncertainty can be. Audiences often hear distant footsteps, cracking branches, or breathing before fully seeing danger. This slower suspense building approach creates anxiety because viewers remain constantly uncertain about where threats are hiding. The editing style also avoids excessive chaos. Modern action movies often rely on rapid cuts that make physical movement difficult to follow. Apex instead allows scenes to breathe. Chase sequences unfold with enough visual clarity that audiences can understand geography and movement. That clarity increases tension because viewers always understand how trapped the protagonist truly is. Music plays a fascinating role throughout the movie. The score remains restrained and atmospheric rather than overwhelming. Instead of massive orchestral themes, the soundtrack often uses ambient textures, deep percussion, distant echoes, and emotional silence. Nature itself becomes part of the soundtrack, wind moving through trees, water crashing against rocks, footsteps through mud, and breathing during moments of fear all become central elements of the film's emotional experience. Silence frequently feels more threatening than music because it forces audiences to focus on environmental danger. Thematically, Apex explores grief in surprisingly emotional ways. The protagonist initially enters the wilderness seeking escape from emotional pain. She hopes isolation and nature might help her process personal trauma. Instead, the wilderness strips away every emotional barrier and forces her into direct confrontation with mortality. This emotional foundation gives the movie greater depth than many survival thrillers. The protagonist is not simply fighting to stay alive physically, she is rediscovering her will to live emotionally. Survival becomes symbolic. Every painful climb, every escape attempt, and every act of resistance reflects her struggle against despair itself. The antagonist, meanwhile, represents predatory nihilism. He views survival and violence almost like sport. Human life means little to him beyond entertainment and domination. This contrast between emotional healing and emotional emptiness creates the film's central conflict beneath the physical chase narrative. One reason the movie generated so much online discussion involves its pacing. Apex takes time establishing atmosphere and emotional context before fully unleashing its survival horror elements. Some viewers appreciated this slower build because it created stronger emotional investment. Others criticized the early sections for lacking momentum. Once the survival conflict fully begins, however, the movie becomes relentless. The tension rarely disappears for long. Every environmental obstacle feels dangerous because the protagonist is already physically and emotionally exhausted. The film understands that suspense becomes more effective when characters gradually lose energy and hope. Charlize Theron's physical commitment became one of the most praised elements of the movie. Many viewers commented on how believable her exhaustion felt. She does not appear glamorous while fighting for survival. Her body language communicates pain, fear, desperation, and determination simultaneously. Taron Egerton's performance also sparked intense reactions online. Audiences were shocked by how disturbing and unpredictable he became in the role. Many social media users joked about never trusting his smile again after watching the movie. His calmness during violent moments creates a deeply uncomfortable atmosphere. The Australian setting itself became a major talking point among audiences. Many viewers praised how effectively the film transformed natural beauty into psychological terror. Unlike urban thrillers where help often feels nearby, Apex traps its characters inside enormous isolated spaces where rescue feels impossible. Social media memes quickly emerged around the movie's intense physical suffering. Clips of Charlize Theron crawling through caves, sprinting through forests, climbing cliffs, and falling into rivers circulated widely online. Some viewers humorously described the film as 2 hours of Charlize Theron refusing to die. Other memes focused on the brutality of the Australian wilderness itself. Audiences joked that the environment seemed just as determined to kill the protagonist as the antagonist did. The film's constant environmental hazards made survival feel exhausting at every moment. The movie also sparked debates regarding realism. Some viewers praised its grounded approach to survival, while others argued certain sequences stretched believability. Discussions frequently focused on whether characters made realistic decisions under pressure or whether some survival moments felt too convenient. These debates actually helped the film remain culturally visible longer than many streaming thrillers. Movies that provoke strong reactions and arguments often maintain audience attention far longer than films that receive simple passive approval. One fascinating aspect of Apex is how it treats vulnerability. Modern action cinema often portrays survival through exaggerated competence and near superhuman endurance. Apex instead emphasizes fear, pain, mistakes, and emotional collapse. The protagonist survives not because she becomes invincible, but because she refuses to stop fighting despite exhaustion. This realism creates stronger emotional investment because viewers believe failure is genuinely possible. Every injury matters. Every bad decision has consequences. Every environmental obstacle drains physical energy further. The costume design subtly reinforces this realism throughout the narrative. Clothing gradually becomes damaged, soaked, muddy, and torn. Cuts and bruises accumulate naturally over time. These visual details help maintain continuity and immersion. Sound design deserves special praise because it contributes enormously to the movie's tension. Forest ambience, distant animal sounds, echoing caves, rushing water, and breathing patterns constantly remind audiences of environmental danger. Some scenes contain very little dialogue because the environment itself communicates fear. The cave sequences especially showcase the power of sound design. Echoes distort movement and distance, making danger feel impossible to locate precisely. Darkness amplifies panic because characters cannot fully trust their senses. The movie's ending generated particularly divided reactions. Some audiences appreciated its emotional ambiguity and refusal to embrace traditional Hollywood triumph. Others found certain narrative decisions frustrating or emotionally unsatisfying. These debates fueled extensive online discussion after release. Streaming audiences often consume thrillers quickly before moving on to the next release, but Apex maintained visibility because viewers continued analyzing its themes, performances, and ending. The combination of survival tension and emotional ambiguity gave people material to debate long after finishing the movie. For Charlize Theron, the film continued her evolution as one of modern cinema's defining action performers while simultaneously emphasizing emotional realism more strongly than many of her previous genre roles. Apex demanded vulnerability rather than polished control. For Taron Egerton, the movie represented a major shift into darker psychological territory. Playing such an unsettling antagonist demonstrated range many audiences had not fully seen from him before. For Baltasar Kormakur, Apex reinforced his reputation as a filmmaker fascinated by survival, nature, endurance, and human vulnerability. His direction consistently prioritizes atmosphere and realism over empty spectacle. The movie's success also highlighted the continued audience appetite for contained survival thrillers. In an era dominated by giant franchises and universe building storytelling, Apex proved that relatively simple concepts can still create powerful cinematic experiences when executed with commitment and craftsmanship. At its core, Apex is ultimately about what remains when comfort disappears. The wilderness strips away civilization, routine, technology, and emotional protection. What survives underneath is instinct, fear, determination, violence. Hope the film repeatedly asks whether survival itself changes people permanently. Once someone experiences life or death desperation, can they ever truly return to normal emotional existence? Apex never provides easy answers. Instead, it leaves audiences with lingering discomfort and emotional exhaustion. The wilderness in the movie feels ancient and indifferent. Nature does not care who deserves survival. It does not reward morality or punish cruelty. Human beings simply struggle within it, desperately trying to remain alive another day. That idea gives Apex its haunting power. Beneath the chase scenes and physical action lies a deeply unsettling truth about human vulnerability. The movie reminds audiences how fragile civilization truly is. Remove safety, communication, and comfort, and survival becomes terrifyingly primal. By the final moments, Apex transforms from a simple thriller into something emotionally heavier. It becomes a story about grief, instinct, resilience, and the terrifying realization that survival often depends on how much suffering a person can endure before finally breaking. And in the brutal world of Apex, breaking is always only one step away. Continue. What makes Apex especially fascinating as a modern thriller is how aggressively it rejects comfort. Most survival films eventually provide moments where audiences can relax, breathe, and believe the protagonist may finally gain control of the situation. Apex almost never allows that emotional release. Every time safety appears possible, the environment or another human threat immediately destroys it. The result is a film that feels psychologically exhausting in the best possible way. Watching it becomes an endurance experience similar to what the characters themselves are suffering on screen. One of the smartest choices in the screenplay involves limiting unnecessary dialogue. Many modern thrillers rely heavily on exposition because filmmakers fear audiences may become confused without constant explanation. Apex trusts visual storytelling instead. Entire sequences unfold through movement, silence, facial expressions, and environmental sounds. The audience learns about fear, trauma, and desperation simply by observing behavior. Charlize Theron's performance benefits enormously from this restrained approach. She communicates emotional devastation through physical detail rather than dramatic speeches. Her character often appears emotionally detached during the opening portions of the film, almost like someone sleepwalking through grief. Small behavioral choices reveal that the wilderness trip is less a vacation and more an attempt to disappear from ordinary life temporarily. The movie gradually reveals pieces of her emotional history without ever becoming overly sentimental. Instead of long flashback scenes explaining trauma directly, the film uses fragmented memories, emotional reactions, and subtle dialogue hints. This allows viewers to interpret the character's pain naturally instead of feeling manipulated by melodrama. Cormaker's direction consistently emphasizes isolation. Wide landscape shots often place the protagonist as a tiny figure surrounded by enormous cliffs, endless forests, or open skies. These compositions visually reinforce how powerless human beings become against nature. The wilderness in Apex never feels welcoming. Even during peaceful moments, there is always underlying tension, as though danger is hiding just outside the frame. The film's middle section contains some of its strongest suspense sequences because this is where psychological trust completely collapses. The protagonist begins questioning every interaction, every sound, and every decision. Audiences experience the same uncertainty because the movie intentionally withholds complete information. The danger feels unpredictable rather than formulaic. Taron Egerton's performance becomes increasingly disturbing during these sequences because he avoids obvious villain behavior. He does not constantly scream threats or perform exaggerated violence. Instead, his calmness becomes terrifying. Some of the most uncomfortable scenes involve ordinary conversation layered with hidden menace. The character behaves like someone who enjoys psychological control as much as physical dominance. That emotional manipulation becomes central to the film's tension. The antagonist wants fear itself to become part of the hunt. He studies reactions, pressures emotional weaknesses, and uses the environment strategically. This transforms the survival conflict into something more personal and psychologically invasive. The wilderness itself almost begins functioning like an accomplice to violence. Narrow paths, unstable cliffs, freezing rivers, and dense forests trap characters constantly. The environment removes the possibility of straightforward escape. Unlike urban thrillers where help may exist around every corner, Apex creates the horrifying sense that nobody is coming to save anyone. One particularly memorable aspect of the film is how it portrays physical exhaustion over time. Many action movies ignore the long term effects of injury and fatigue. Characters suffer wounds but continue functioning almost normally minutes later. Apex instead allows pain to accumulate realistically. Injuries affect movement, cold weather slows reactions, lack of rest damages judgment. This realism strengthens every action sequence because viewers understand the protagonist cannot rely on endless physical energy. Each climb, sprint, or fight consumes valuable strength. Survival becomes a matter of resource management as much as courage. The filmmakers reportedly paid careful attention to survival detail during production. Climbing techniques, navigation methods, emergency decision making, and environmental hazards were designed to feel believable rather than exaggerated for cinematic convenience. While the film still embraces dramatic storytelling, it grounds those moments in recognizable human vulnerability. Another major strength of Apex is its refusal to romanticize violence. Action scenes feel painful and desperate instead of stylish. Characters panic during confrontations. Fights become chaotic struggles rather than elegant choreography. This grounded approach makes even smaller moments of violence feel dangerous because viewers believe serious injury or death could happen suddenly. The movie's use of water is especially effective. Rivers, rain, waterfalls, and wet cave systems create constant discomfort and danger throughout the story. Water becomes symbolic of emotional instability while also serving as a practical survival obstacle. Several sequences involving swimming or river crossings rank among the film's most tense moments because the environment itself becomes physically overwhelming. The costume and makeup departments deserve enormous credit for maintaining realism across the movie's timeline. As the story progresses, clothing becomes increasingly damaged, dirty, and soaked. Cuts worsen, bruises darken, exhaustion becomes visible through posture and facial detail. These subtle visual elements help the audience track the physical deterioration of the protagonist. One reason Apex connected strongly with streaming audiences is because it taps into modern fears surrounding trust and vulnerability. The idea of entering isolation for healing only to encounter predatory violence feels psychologically terrifying. The movie suggests danger often hides behind ordinary charm and normal behavior, which creates lingering unease even after the film ends. This fear becomes amplified because the antagonist initially appears socially functional and emotionally controlled. He does not resemble a traditional cinematic monster. Instead, he feels disturbingly believable, like someone capable of blending into ordinary life unnoticed. That realism makes his violence more frightening than exaggerated horror villains. The supporting cast also plays an important role in maintaining suspense. Smaller characters often exist in morally uncertain territory, forcing the protagonist and audience to constantly question motives and loyalties. The screenplay carefully avoids making everyone immediately trustworthy or immediately suspicious. That ambiguity keeps tension alive throughout the story. The film's pacing remains one of its most divisive elements. Some audiences expected non stop action from the beginning and became impatient with the slower emotional setup. Others appreciated how deliberately the story builds atmosphere before fully descending into survival horror. This slower opening ultimately strengthens the emotional impact because viewers understand the protagonist's mental state before chaos erupts. Once the tension escalates, however, the film rarely slows down again. The narrative transforms into a relentless survival chase where even temporary moments of calm feel dangerous. Kormakar expertly manipulates pacing by alternating bursts of panic with quieter scenes filled with emotional dread. The nighttime sequences deserve particular praise because they create extraordinary tension without relying excessively on darkness to hide weak visuals. Moonlight, flashlights, distant fires, and natural shadows create eerie visibility where audiences can partially see danger without fully understanding it. This uncertainty becomes psychologically effective because the imagination fills in missing details. Sound design continues playing a massive role during these scenes. Tiny environmental noises suddenly become terrifying. A branch snapping in darkness can create more fear than a loud musical sting because the audience knows danger may already be nearby. One fascinating thematic layer in Apex involves the relationship between civilization and primal instinct. The film suggests modern society creates the illusion of safety and control, but beneath that surface, humans remain deeply primitive when survival is threatened. Fear strips away social mask quickly. Morality becomes unstable under extreme pressure. The antagonist embraces this primal worldview openly. He sees survival and dominance as games proving superiority. The protagonist initially rejects that mentality but gradually learns she must access darker survival instincts to stay alive. This psychological transformation gives the movie emotional complexity beyond simple predator versus prey storytelling. The Australian wilderness setting intensifies these themes beautifully. The landscape feels ancient, harsh, and indifferent to human morality. Mountains and forests existed long before civilization and will continue existing long after individual human lives disappear. That perspective makes the survival struggle feel simultaneously intimate and insignificant. The cinematography frequently emphasizes this contrast by placing tiny human figures against massive natural environments. These images visually communicate how fragile people truly are when removed from technological comfort and urban structure. Another reason the movie gains strong online attention involves its physical authenticity compared to many modern streaming thrillers. Audiences increasingly recognize when actors genuinely perform demanding physical sequences rather than relying entirely on digital enhancement. Theron's visible exhaustion and physical commitment gave the movie credibility that viewers appreciated. Several behind the scenes stories reportedly describe difficult production conditions involving cold water, remote terrain, and physically demanding stunt work. These production realities translated directly into the film's atmosphere. Actors were not pretending to suffer in comfortable studio conditions. The environment itself constantly challenged them. The movie also avoids excessive humor, which helps maintain emotional tension. Many modern action thrillers interrupt suspense constantly with jokes designed to keep audiences comfortable. Apex rarely does this. The tone remains serious, tense, and emotionally heavy almost throughout the entire runtime. This tonal commitment makes the occasional quieter human moments feel more meaningful. Small acts of kindness, vulnerability, or emotional honesty stand out powerfully because the surrounding atmosphere feels so hostile and dangerous.